You're listening to the story of the cowboy who gave up on love until a native woman taught him to feel again, a tale of loss, silence, and a quiet miracle of healing. Set in the unforgiving winter of 1880 for Montana, this is not just a western, it's a journey into the soul of a man who believed his heart had frozen forever until one day, the snow gave him back a reason to feel. The winter of 1884 was merciless. Bitter winds howled through Montana's wide-open valleys like wolves hunting the last remnants of life. Snow swallowed everything in sight: fences, trails, even the breath of men who dared to travel too far from their cabins. It was a season that made the heart ache and the bones brittle. At the edge of this frozen wilderness stood a lonely ranch, a collection of rough-hewn buildings nestled against a crooked line of cotton woods. The man who lived there had become as silent and cold as the land itself. Arthur Prescott moved like a ghost through the blizzard, his heavy boots crunching over hardened snow. His coat, stitched from elk hide and lined with worn wool, clung to his stoic frame. He was a man carved from solitude, from grief that no fire could thaw. It had been 5 long years since Martha and little Tom succumbed to the fever. 5 years since laughter had echoed off these cabin walls. 5 years since he'd heard anything other than the crackle of firewood or the lowing of cattle. He hadn't come here to live, he'd come here to forget, to let the silence consume him until he vanished entirely. That morning, after 3 days of blinding snow, the wind finally calmed a malicious whisper. Arthur knew he couldn't delay any longer. He wrapped himself in wool and fur and saddled up to check the fences and his cattle, many of which he'd herded into the lean to beside the barn before the worst of the storm. His breath steamed in the frigid air. The sky above was the color of bruised steel. Snow blanketed the landscape like a funeral shroud. And that's when he saw her. At first, it looked like driftwood or perhaps the carcass of some animal half buried near the creek. But as Arthur approached, he noticed something strange: beaded moccasins poking from the snow, a spill of long black hair, and the subtle rise and fall of a chest still breathing. She was young native, clearly. Her skin was ashen and cold, her limbs stiff. She wore a thin deerskin dress that offered no protection against the storm. Snow crusted her lashes, her lips pale as ivory. Arthur stood there, rifle slung across his back, torn between instinct and empathy. He had kept himself for a reason. He had buried his heart with his family, left it in the graveyard outside Redemption's tiny church. This woman was a complication, a risk, a stranger in a world where strangers could mean death. But, still, he couldn't turn away. Grimacing, he knelt beside her and pressed his fingers against her throat. A pulse, barely. His mind screamed to leave her. But his hands moved anyway, scooping her up, lifting the fragile weight of her against his chest. Her skin was like marble. The wine fought him with every step as he trudged back to the cabin. It wasn't heroism, it was memory. He saw Martha's face in the woman's pale cheeks. He heard the echo of his son's laughter in the silence of the woods. The wilderness had taken so much from him, he would not let it take her. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the stove hit him like a hammer. He laid her carefully on a blanket near the fire, not on his cot, which remained untouched. That space still belonged to ghosts. He worked quickly, removed her frozen moccasins, peeled away her soaked outer garments, rubbed her hands and feet with coarse wool, trying to coax blood back into her limbs. She didn't stir. He wrapped her in his thickest blanket and brewed a pot of coffee so black it could wake the dead. He lifted her head and tipped the mug to her lips. Most of it spilled, but he tried again. Hours passed. The cabin grew uncomfortably hot, but he refused to let the fire die. He didn't know who she was. He didn't ask. He didn't speak. But, for the first time in years, Arthur Prescott felt something he didn't recognize. Hope, fragile and flickering. Late in the afternoon, she stirred. Her eyelids fluttered. When they opened, dark eyes blinked at him, disoriented, frightened. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Easy now," Arthur said, his voice unused to kindness. "You were near frozen. I found you in the snow." She said nothing, only looked at him as though trying to measure his intent. He offered water. She sipped, her hands trembling. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. Then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "Winona." Arthur nodded. Arthur Prescott. That was all. No questions. No explanations. Just two names spoken into the stillness of a cabin that had forgotten the sound of conversation. For the next several days, the blizzard outside gave way to eerie calm. Inside, another storm slowly unraveled. Winona remained quiet, observant. She spoke little, but her presence was steady. Arthur maintained his gruffness, kept his distance. Yet, he made sure she was fed, warm, safe. He slept on the floor near the door, rifle beside him, not out of distrust, but protection. When she did speak, he learned fragments of her story. Lakota, alone, searching for distant relatives. The scars on her arms said more than her words ever could. Arthur never asked for details. He knew pain when he saw it. Sometimes, he found himself watching her when she mended her clothing with a bone needle, when she swept the floor with a makeshift broom, when she sat near the fire with a look in her eyes that seemed older than time. He didn't understand it yet, but something inside him was changing. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning, a hairline crack in the ice. Each day that passed in Arthur Prescott's cabin carved a new rhythm into the silence that had once ruled the place. It wasn't a loud rhythm, nothing so obvious, but more like the distant heartbeat of something slowly waking. Winona, though still pale and thin, moved with quiet purpose. She was cautious around Arthur, always maintaining a respectful distance, her eyes searching but never pleading. She swept the floor with a bundled branch, fed kindling into the stove, and helped prepare simple meals. She didn't ask questions. She didn't make assumptions. She simply existed, and somehow, that was enough to change everything. Arthur watched it happen the way a man might watch spring thaw a frozen river, hesitant to believe, yet unable to ignore. There was one evening, late in the week, when something subtle shifted. Arthur was cleaning his rifle by the fire, his hands moving in practiced rhythm, the iron gleaming under the flickering flame. Winona sat quietly across the room, sewing a tear in her sleeve with sinew she had salvaged from her pouch. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "You are a sad man." Arthur's hands paused mid-motion. He didn't look up. "Many people are," he replied flatly, continuing to polish the barrel. She didn't flinch. "Your sadness is heavy, like snow before it melts," he said. Nothing. To Arthur, grief had become a private language, a winter inside his chest that he didn't want to explain. But Winona's words, simple, imperfect English, cut through his defenses with uncanny accuracy. He had thought his sorrow invisible, that no one could see it unless he chose to show them, but she had seen it. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor near the door, wrapped in a blanket, rifle by his side. Yet his thoughts returned to her voice again and again. Something about her presence disarmed him, not in weakness, but in a quiet recognition. Like she had suffered long before he ever met her, like they were both fragments of something that used to be whole. As the weather slowly turned, the days grew longer, and the snow around the ranch began to thin. The high ridges still gleamed with white, but patches of earth emerged here and there like bruises under pale skin. With spring creeping closer, Winona grew stronger. She rose earlier. She helped with the cattle, showed Arthur plants he hadn't known were edible, roots tucked beneath rocks, tea leaves gathered near a thicket. She even made a salve for his shoulder from crushed willow bark and bear fat. He never asked how she knew these things. He only noticed the difference when the ache in his bones began to dull. They never spoke of the day she would leave, but it hung in the air like distant thunder. Arthur knew it would come. The snow would melt, the passes would open, and she would go find whatever family or tribe she had left. And yet, he found himself dreading it in a way he hadn't expected. The isolation he had once wrapped around himself like armor now seemed thinner, more fragile. When she was outside gathering herbs or hauling water from the creek, he would listen for her steps. When she was inside, He grew used to the sound of her movements, the soft rustle of her dress, the way she hummed under her breath when she cooked. One afternoon, he returned from checking a fence line and found her by the creek, kneeling on a flat stone, washing her hair in the meltwater. Her hair, long and black, shimmered in the sunlight like obsidian. For a moment, he just watched. There was no lust in his gaze, just awe. A reverent stillness, like watching a hawk fly or a deer pause in the mist. She was life, real, undeniable, a piece of beauty that had somehow survived the harshness of the world. Arthur turned away before she saw him. But the feeling lingered, and for the first time in years, something inside him stirred that wasn't made of grief. That evening, she brought it up. "You go to the town soon?" she asked while folding a spare blanket beside the fire. Arthur, taken off guard, nodded slowly. "Maybe in a day or two. Need supplies." She hesitated, then said, "I have beads, small things. I trade for cloth or needles." He looked at her. Her gaze was steady but quiet, a little hopeful, a little vulnerable. Redemption wasn't a town known for kindness, especially not to native women. Arthur knew that. He remembered the glares he'd received on his last visit just for being silent and solitary. Bringing her with him would draw attention, unwanted and dangerous, but when he opened his mouth to refuse, he saw something in her expression. Not fear, not pleading, just dignity, a woman trying to survive, a woman asking for help the only way she knew how, and something inside him cracked. "We leave in the morning," he said, his voice slower than usual. She smiled, faintly. He turned away to hide the strange warmth blooming in his chest. The next day, they rode into town together, Arthur on his gelding, Winona on the mare he usually used for hauling supplies. The trail to Redemption was long and rough, winding through timber and muddy passes. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was no longer awkward. It had grown companionable, even protective. But, as the town's wooden buildings came into view leaning and gray under a sky the color of tin, Arthur felt the old familiar tightness return to his gut. Redemption was not a place that offered second chances. It was a place where people stared too long and judged too quickly, and he was bringing her into the lion's den. He dismounted in front of Henderson's general store, the largest in town. "Stay close," he muttered to Winona. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her presence like a shadow beside him. Inside, the store smelled of dust, gun oil, and tobacco. Henderson, the portly shopkeeper with calculating eyes, looked up from his ledger. "Prescott," he said, voice clipped. "Been a while." Arthur listed the supplies he needed: flour, coffee, salt, and ammunition, then gestured to Winona. "She's got something to trade." Winona, cautious, produced a small beaded pouch, intricate, delicate, full of quiet skill. Henderson barely glanced at it. "Don't have much call for engine trinkets," he said. Arthur felt heat rise in his chest. "It's fine work," he said. "Take a proper look." The tension grew thick. Winona's expression remained calm, but he saw her fingers twitch at her sides. Then the door creaked open behind them, and everything changed. 3 men entered. One of them was Bart Logan, mean-spirited, small-eyed, and always half-drunk. Well, Logan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Didn't know you were the type, Prescott? Bringing a squad to town?" "Huh." Winona flinched. Arthur stepped between them, his shoulders squaring. "Mind your business," Logan sneered. "It is my business. Don't like her kind messing up our town." And then, with deliberate malice, he spat tobacco juice near her feet. Arthur's jaw clenched, his vision narrowed. All the years of silence, of buried pain, of pretending he didn't care, they ended in that moment. "She's with me," he said, his voice cold as iron. "And if you've got a problem with that," he took a step forward, "then you've got a problem with me." Bart Logan wasn't the kind of man who backed down easily. He swaggered through life with a chip on his shoulder and 2 lackeys behind him to back up whatever stupidity he decided to unleash. But Arthur Prescott wasn't the same man Logan might have pushed around in years past. He wasn't grieving anymore. He wasn't hiding. He was protecting. And the moment Arthur stood between Winona and the leering men, redemption fell into a tense silence. "Well, look at that," Logan chuckled, his voice ugly with mock amusement. "Prescott's got a soft spot after all. Or maybe just lonely out on that ranch of yours." His words hung in the stale air of the general store, sharp as broken glass. Henderson stood behind the counter, shifting nervously, pretending to tally items he wasn't touching. Arthur didn't respond, not yet. He just stared. Logan, emboldened, stepped forward, reaching as if to brush Winona's arm, maybe shove her just enough to remind everyone who was in charge. But Arthur moved faster. His hand clamped around Logan's wrist like an iron snare, and the man gasped in surprise. His smirk vanished as pain flashed across his face. "I said," Arthur growled, voice like gravel and cold steel, "leave her be." The room seemed to freeze. Even the fire in the iron stove crackled more quietly. All right, let go," Logan snapped, trying to jerk away. Arthur didn't let go. Not immediately. He stared into Logan's eyes, not with anger but with certainty. He wasn't threatening. He was warning. And finally, he released the man's arm, giving it a small shove for good measure. Logan stumbled back into his companions, his pride more wounded than his wrist. "This ain't over," Logan hissed, backing toward the door. "No," Arthur said, voice steady. "It is." Logan and his crew left in a swirl of dust and muttered curses. No one in the store spoke for a moment. Henderson finally cleared his throat. "You want the cloth and needles or not?" Arthur turned to him. "Best quality you've got." Henderson hesitated, then reached for the shelf behind him and measured out a length of sturdy wool cloth and a packet of new needles. Arthur placed a few silver coins on the counter. Then, with pointed deliberation, he picked up Winona's beaded pouch and returned it to her hands. "If a man can't see the worth in something beautiful," he said softly, "he's not worth listening to." Winona met his eyes. There was no smile on her lips, but something passed between them unspoken but strong. They left the store together, walking back into the watery afternoon sun. The streets of Redemption were quieter now, eyes peeking from windows and doorways. No one said a word, but they all saw. Arthur helped Winona mount the mare, then swung onto his own horse. They rode away from town, their backs straight, their silence carrying the weight of something solid. On the trail back to the ranch, the atmosphere was different. Not tense, just full of the things they hadn't said, full of the questions still unspoken. Arthur found himself replaying the scene over and over in his head. Not just Logan's insults, but the way he had reacted, the way he had stepped forward, the way his blood had surged not from anger, but from a raw, protective instinct he hadn't felt since his family was alive. He glanced at Winona riding beside him. She sat tall, her face unreadable, but he noticed the way her hands were steady on the reins. She hadn't flinched once on the trail. It wasn't just her presence that was changing things. It was her strength, her quiet courage, the way she met a world that rejected her not with anger, but with pride. Back at the ranch, the light was soft and golden, brushing the pine trees and snowbanks with the promise of spring. The scent of thawing earth was in the air, and the silence between them was no longer that of strangers, but of people who had shared something real. As Arthur unsaddled the horses and brought them to the stable, he noticed Winona slipping quietly into the cabin. A few minutes later, he followed. She was standing near the hearth, stirring a pot of rabbit stew with a carved wooden spoon. The firelight played against her cheekbones, catching the contours of her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. Arthur hesitated. Then, words came gruff and low. They had no right. Winona didn't turn, but she nodded slowly. "Few believe that," she said. "But you did." He took a step closer. "They treated you like you didn't matter." "I've seen worse," she murmured. "But you were like the bear. The bear." He raised an eyebrow, protecting its own. He didn't smile, not exactly, but his features softened just a little, maybe for the first time in years. Later that night, they sat by the fire after supper, each quietly lost in thought. Winona sewed something a leather pouch with a new pattern. Arthur carved notches into a fence post he'd cut down earlier. It should have felt awkward. It did and single quotes t. There was a rhythm to it now. Not quite friendship. Not yet love, but something alive. Winona set down her sewing and looked up. You think I should leave soon? Arthur didn't answer at first. Then he shook his head. Not if you don't want to. She nodded, then said nothing more. It wasn't an invitation. Not really, but it was enough. And for the moment, that was all either of them needed. Spring didn't come with trumpets and fanfare. It came slowly, like a whisper after years of silence. The wind still carried a chill, but the snow was receding. Patches of grass pushed through the frost like survivors refusing to stay buried. Birds returned to the cottonwoods, cautious but persistent, and something similar was happening inside Arthur Prescott. The days passed in a rhythm unlike anything he had known before. Not rushed, not demanding, steady. Winona worked beside him now, tending to the chickens, gathering herbs, mending tools and garments with the same grace she had used when nursing herself back to life. She never asked for more, but she gave much. Her presence brought a quiet energy into the cabin, like a hearth newly stoked. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was undeniable. One morning, Arthur awoke to the smell of something other than his own fire-roasted coffee. Winona had made a tea from mint and sweetgrass she'd found near the stream. He sipped it without comment, but something softened in his face that hadn't in years. That afternoon, while checking a corner of the fence line, Arthur found himself staring out at the horizon longer than usual. The land hadn't changed, but it felt different. Less empty. That night, they shared a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread she had helped bake in the cast-iron skillet. Afterward, she sat by the door, stringing beads from her small pouch, crafting a pattern into something intricate and beautiful. Arthur watched her hands. They were strong, but nimble, scarred in places, but sure. She never wasted movement, never did anything halfway. Her silence wasn't born of fear, it was choice. It was control, and Arthur respected that more than he could put into words. As the firelight flickered across the cabin walls, he finally spoke. You've been through worse than just a snowstorm. Winona looked up, her eyes unreadable for a moment, then she nodded once. Many winters. He didn't press, didn't ask for stories. He didn't need to. Instead, he told her slowly, haltingly, about Martha, about their son, about the fever that came like a thief in the night and took everything. I stopped feeling after that, he admitted, his voice gravel and ash. It was easier. Winona said nothing for a long while. Then, gently, and now, he stared into the fire. The wood popped. Shadows danced. Now, I don't know, he said, but I don't wake up angry anymore. Or numb. She nodded. Then you are healing. Arthur blinked at her, surprised. He had never thought of it that way. Grief had always seemed like a frozen lake and moving, endless, but she was right. There were cracks in the ice now. Sunlight slipped in through places he'd once kept dark. Later in the week, Arthur rode out to the far pasture while Winona stayed behind to tend the cabin. When he returned, saddle creaking under him, he found her crouched in the garden patch near the east wall, planting dried seeds she'd scavenged from wild squash. He dismounted and watched her for a moment. She moved like someone who believed in the future. That simple act, planting, meant she thought she'd still be here to harvest it. It was a small thing, but it nearly undid him. He cleared his throat. You really think anything will grow there? She smiled. Faint but true. If the ground is ready. Arthur couldn't help but feel that she wasn't just talking about the soil. That evening, they sat outside for the first time since the snow melted, watching the sun dip behind the ridges. Winona wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Arthur leaned against the post, sipping from a tin cup. The land is changing, she said, her eyes on the horizon. It feels kinder. Arthur followed her gaze. It was the same land he'd stared at alone for years, same trees, same sky, but she was right. It did feel different. The silence between them felt full, not empty. The wind was softer. The loneliness had been replaced not with noise, but with presence, with meaning. He turned to her, studying her profile, her strength, her stillness. Do you miss them? He asked. Finally, my people, she said. He nodded. Double quotes every day, she said simply, but grief is not a wall. It is a river. It flows. We learned to swim. Arthur didn't reply. He didn't have to. That metaphor lodged itself in his heart. One night, as the stars emerged like shy guests in a vast ballroom of black velvet, Arthur reached into a drawer and pulled out something he hadn't touched in years. A music box. It was small, tarnished with time, and played only a few soft notes when he turned the crank notes Martha had once hummed while putting Tom to sleep. He sat it on the table, let it sing. Winona listened, her head slightly tilted, her fingers still. When the tune faded, she looked at him. You still love them? I always will, he said. She nodded. Love doesn't end. It changes, like rivers, too. And Arthur realized something profound in that moment. He wasn't replacing Martha or Tom. He wasn't forgetting them. He was learning how to live beside the memory. How to open his heart to something new without bearing the old. Winona hadn't taken their place, but she had built one of her own. By the time the wildflowers began dotting the valley floor yellow and violet splashes against the awakening earth, Arthur Prescott no longer felt like a man waiting to die. The routine hadn't changed much. There were still cows to feed, fences to mend, wood to split, but now, the silence of the ranch had changed in texture. It wasn't hollow anymore. It was calm, shared. Winona's presence, once a disruption to his isolation, had become essential to his days. She had a way of existing without intrusion, never demanding, never loud, but always there, like sunlight that didn't force its way through the window, just waited patiently for the shutters to open. One evening, Arthur returned from the pasture to find her sitting on the porch step, her knees pulled close, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was watching the mountains with a gaze that reached beyond the visible. He joined her in silence, settling beside her. Their shoulders brushed, neither of them pulling away. The land is changing, she said softly. It's not as angry. Arthur nodded. You think land can be angry? She smiled. Not angry like people. Angry like it's been waiting too long for someone to listen. Arthur didn't say anything, but he understood. That's what his grief had been like, too. Not rage, not bitterness, just something silent and ancient that had gone too long without a voice, and now, somehow, she had given it one. The days grew longer, the light warmer. Winona planted herbs along the cabin's back wall. She strung bone and beads into patterns that Arthur couldn't decipher, but that she said told stories older than the mountains. She began teaching him how to brew teas that eased his joints, how to bind a wound with bark and honey. He taught her how to reinforce fence posts, how to spot a sick calf, how to read the clouds for coming storms. They didn't talk about the future, not directly, but it hung in the space between them like a question neither of them was afraid of anymore. One morning, Arthur found her packing a small satchel. His stomach tightened. You leaving? He asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, her expression unreadable. No, she said. Just organizing. I am not ready yet. Are you? He didn't answer right away. Then finally, I don't think I want you to go. Winona set the satchel aside, walked toward him. Her eyes were calm, steady. I know, she said. That night, as stars blinked awake and the breeze carried the scent of pine and promise, Arthur told her something he hadn't said aloud in years. I thought I was done feeling, he said, voice barely above the creak of the cabin wood. After Martha, after Tom, I figured that part of me had just frozen over, that I'd carry the cold to my grave. Winona didn't interrupt, But you. He swallowed. You remind me what it's like to be warm again. She reached for his hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just a simple gesture. Her fingers slid into his, and for a moment, they just sat like that. She said, "You were not meant to die in the snow." He looked at her, saw the strength in her gentleness, the fire in her stillness, and for the first time, he let himself believe it. In the weeks that followed, they stopped pretending she might leave. The chores were done side by side. Meals were made together. She began carving new designs into the cabin walls, symbols from her people's stories. He let her, encouraged her. The cabin, once a tomb of grief, became something new, a home, even when a few men from town rode by, curious about the pair of them. Arthur made it clear with his eyes and the rifle across his lap that she wasn't a guest. She was family now. They never said love out loud. It didn't seem necessary. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the mountains glowed gold in the last light, Winona spoke a truth that wrapped up everything they had become. "I am home, Arthur." He looked at her, and in that moment, he understood something profound. Love wasn't just fire and passion and declarations. Sometimes, it was just showing up. Every day, every quiet morning, every silent evening. It was defending someone when the world wouldn't. It was learning to live with ghosts and still make room for the living. It was to broken people finding peace in the cracks. Arthur had once believed his heart was buried with his wife and son. But now, he knew, he hadn't been buried, he'd been hibernating. And thanks to Winona, spring had finally come. This story is not just about romance or redemption, it's about the resilience of the human spirit, the healing power of connection, and how love can return when you've given up on ever feeling again. In a world still full of loneliness and cold silences, stories like Arthur and Winona's remind us, no matter how long winter lasts, spring always finds a way.